Hi, this is Dr. Toby, your host on Health and Wellness. We've got a great show with Charles and Helen Beatty. Charles is the CEO of Mississippi Food Network, ably supported by his wife Helen. They are both doctorate degree holders. Helen went to Mississippi State University and Tougaloo. Charles went to Michigan State University. They've been married 26 years. Charles was a former president of Piney Woods High School College and now is leading the Mississippi Food Network that takes care of 150,000 hungry Mississippians. Yes, 150,000 hungry Mississippians every month. Mississippi is officially the hungriest state in the nation, and he's leading the charge in 56 counties to bring food to these people. He says for every dollar you give him, he can put food on the table for 6 individuals. We are supporting him. We want you to support him, but they have a great story to tell. You will love to hear their story. God bless you. Jesus is Lord. Hi, this is Dr. Moma, your host on Health and Wellness. Thank you for joining us. We've been so honored, privileged for the last few weeks to have Dr. Charles and Helen Beatty on our show. Dr. Charles is a graduate of Michigan State University. His wife Helen is a graduate of Mississippi State University. They've been married 26 years. Charles is the CEO of the Mississippi Food Network, a group that works in almost 56 counties in Mississippi and feeds about 150,000 people a month, and it's the major food platform for the state of Mississippi for those who are indigent and can't get access to food. They've been doing a great work. He's been there for 9 years and supported avidly by his wife. And we've been sharing their life story, talking about what the Mississippi Food Network does and their faith journey. I want to talk today about their background and what they have done over the last 30 years. Tell us a bit about the journey to Virgin Island. What was going on in Virgin Island when you went there?
I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier interviews that I worked at the Pineywood School for a while. Left there after 20 years. Went to Washington, D.C. for a while. Left there after a couple of years. Ran a small elementary through 7th grade school with a small boarding component, as a matter of fact. Stayed there for a couple of years. And then I got a call.
Was that in D.C.?
That was in Tennessee.
In Tennessee.
It was in Tennessee. Yeah. Then I got a call from a friend of mine in the Virgin Islands who asked me if I would be willing to come down to work with him at the Virgin Island University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disability. He was working on St. Thomas, and the university had campuses on St. Thomas and St. Croix, and he needed somebody to run the office on St. Croix. So we ended up moving to St. Croix and ended up staying there for 5 years. It was an excellent experience. I'll never forget it.
Center for Excellence
in terms of the work that we were doing down there,
right.
Working with people with developmental disability.
Oh.
Right. So it was a great experience in that regard, and it was a good experience living off of the mainland in order to see how people live in other. Well, it's an American territory,
right.
But it was a different culture.
Right.
And it was a great experience in that regard.
Wow. Did you have obviously they gave you a house, or you're living on the beach? Was it? That's what we all know about St. Croix, St. Thomas, the beach, white sand, blue water, Virgin Islands.
It was all of that. It was a beautiful place to live.
Oh.
We weren't quite living on the beach. We were about a mile from the beach, but we were in an elevated area where you can sit on the balcony and look out over the blue ocean. It was a nice place.
Oh. And of course, were the students were they developmentally disabled, or you were studying the work you
We
did on
weren't
them?
studying. We were working with the population
Okay,
on the island
on the
who had
island.
developmental
Who had
disabilities,
okay.
all kinds of disabilities. I remember we had one of the youngsters come in, and he didn't have control of his hand, and he demonstrated how he was able to tie his shoes with a pair of pliers.
Oh
If
wow,
you've ever tried to tie your shoes with a pair of pliers, you can
wow.
understand what he was
Was
going
going
through
through.
in that regard. A
Wow.
lot of people don't pay attention to the fact that there are individuals out there with disabilities and what their needs are. We had a gentleman who was very friendly. He loved to visit with his friends, but he couldn't come into the house that we lived in because of the steps, and he couldn't go to the bathroom because the doors weren't wide enough. Those are the kinds of things that people
Think
overlook
about.
when it comes to people with
Mm.
disabilities. So I enjoyed that work. Met a lot of good people, and it was a great time.
It's not common to have two PhD holders in the same family. I mean, both of you are PhD holders. Am I correct? And I think the statistics say about maybe 0.3% or so of Americans have PhDs. And for both of you to be a couple is even rarer. So I want you to start. What inspired you to run to get a PhD? I mean, were you the first PhD in your family?
I was the only one in my family to go to college, in my immediate family, to go to college. As I mentioned earlier, I was raised in Flint, Michigan, and I'm just laughing about the fact I was in Troop 53, Boy Scouts. My father served as a scoutmaster.
Oh,
If you knew my father, you'd understand why I'm laughing. That's not really his personality, but he enjoyed doing it. So we had occasion, Troop 53, to be invited to usher a football game at Michigan State University. It was on one of the bluest blue sky days that I've ever had the experience of seeing. The people were loud and colorful, and I made up in my mind at 12 years old that I was going to go to Michigan State University. A few
East
years
Lansing.
later, I
Right.
was graduating from there
Oh
with a
wow.
PhD. That's how I ended up at Michigan State University. My first degree was in advertising. I have always been interested in drawing and advertising kinds of things. Writing, I love writing,
Wow.
and so I was going to go into advertising. I graduated with that degree, went to work for Bendix Aerospace in Ann Arbor, and I was there for a year, and one of my college professors called me up and said that there was a program that was being initiated that I really needed to apply for, a master's degree in urban counseling.
Wow.
So I did that for a year and graduated into the PhD program.
Wow.
Did that in 3 years and ended up with the doctorate in urban counseling. I mean, the master's in urban counseling and the doctorate in urban counseling with a cognate in psychology, similar to the degree
So
that my
you,
wife
you
holds.
you you weren't pressured into it. You weren't compelled. Your dad wasn't like holding a sword over you. It wasn't something you did it voluntarily. You wanted to do it.
Right. My parents, my both graduated from high school. My father was a factory worker. My mother was a domestic, but they encouraged me to get an education, and that was my way up the rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. But they didn't hold any a gun to my
Wow.
head and told me
Right.
what I needed to do. God was in control,
Yeah.
and I just went with the flow.
Wow. How about you? What was your reason or
Yeah,
your?
actually, I love hearing my husband talk about his dad being the troop leader of his Boy Scouts troop.
It was a funny
It was
time.
a funny time, yes, actually. But in our household, it was 11 of us, and I was the latter part of the kids in my family. So my dad could not read. My mom had, I think, about a fifth grade education, could read some. Again, she was a cook and had been a domestic. My dad was a carpenter. He made custom-made cabins and refinished antiques and those kinds of things. But education was definitely something that was stressed. My journey was a little different. I left high school in 11th grade in an accelerated program from Tougaloo College. So I had to get a college degree because I didn't have a high school diploma. and, and after finishing my undergraduate degree at Tougaloo, matriculated to Mississippi State.
What did you study at Tougaloo?
At Tougaloo, psychology was my psychology, sociology at Tougaloo, and then went to Mississippi State, received a fellowship there to get a master's in vocational rehabilitation counseling. But I really never worked in that area. After finishing my master's degree, I actually was hired on at Mississippi Valley State University in the faculty and taught in their academic learning center. A number of students who are coming to college sometimes aren't college ready. So they had to take a number of prep courses, and I was a part of that team that taught prep courses, and I kind of laugh. I have a picture in my living room now with one of my most famous students was Jerry Rice.
Jerry Rice.
Football player.
Football player.
Right. San Francisco. Willie Totten. Totten actually was the one that always set Rice up to get those passes. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, he was inducted in the Hall of Fame, and I was excited to be able to join him at that event for Mississippi, the Hall of Fame. But was there for about 5 years and just felt that I needed to, if I was going to stay in that area, I needed sort of my insurance card. So I went back to Mississippi State and finished on August 8th of 1988 my doctorate degree, and I was actually hired on in the midst of my program with Weyerhaeuser Paper Company. So that started, I always wanted to work in industry. And they were building a state-of-the-art paper facility in Columbus, Mississippi, and I was a part of that team that helped to devise a number of the hiring practices, their pay performance programs. It was, more
but
industrial
psychology. Your PhD was in?
It was in education with a cognate in industrial psychology.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And so that's how I ended up working in the industry for those number of years. Left Weyerhaeuser, was hired away from there, recruited rather, joined Amoco Oil Company. So I'm really dating myself in terms of age because Amoco is VP. Right. I went to Amoco in Houston, Texas. Was there, was recruited away, joined International Paper Company, was the HR manager for they had an oil and gas division because they owned Weyerhaeuser. International Paper, like Weyerhaeuser, has a lot of land, so you got reserves and other things, minerals that they're able to extract. So I was the director of the HR for their oil and gas division, and was recruited away from there to join the Morris family at Uncle Ben's Rice. So I was an HR manager for Uncle Ben's Rice.
Owned by the Morris family?
Morris, yeah, like Mars bars and Snickers and Dove.
Wow.
They're privately held, so they own a whole lot of things that you would never think of unless you read the fine print. But worked there with them for Uncle Ben's, and of course, my husband, while I was I guess I moved to Texas. This is the funny part about us, how he told you about how we met. We were part of the speaking circuit at Mississippi University for Women. They hold something every year called Governor's Club, and it's where they bring kids who are interested in the legislative process and kind of indoctrinating them early on. So this is students from all over Mississippi and other places who come to University of Mississippi for Women, and Doc was a keynote luncheon speaker, but then we were on a panel together. So 2 years later, he met me then. I guess I gave him my number, told him I was at Weyerhaeuser. Long and short, 2 years later, he called my job at Weyerhaeuser, and our secretary answered the phone. He was looking, he said, I'm looking for somebody, Dr. Glenn. Deborah Glenn is her name. That was not my name, okay? Really? Deborah was not my name. He could not remember my name, but he remembered. I'm calling her. And she said, she's been gone now for about 2 years. She lives in Houston. And so it was so ironic. 2 weeks later, he said, I've got a conference in Houston. He called me. He said, I'm so sorry. I know that lady told you that I got your name wrong, but I'm coming to Houston. I'm wondering if you'll have dinner with me. And so this is how our relationship kind of kindled from there. And yeah, so you never.
26 years later.
Here we are. That's right.
God
So
been faithful.
yes, he has. So that has sort of been my journey. It was more in the corporate world.
Wow. Wow.
and the human resources arena, doing a number of cool things, working with a number of consultants out there who did a lot in the, this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, mid 90s, around social technical design. You know, you got more equipment
Right.
in manufacturing now, and you have to teach people how do you coexist with all of this equipment but have foster communications, because the process has to be maintained.
Right.
Everybody is about making money in manufacturing, as you well know, in industry. So that's kind of our journey, and actually how we connected in my background and what I've
So
done.
Doc has this book, okay? Don't be a fool for hip hop.
Correct.
So basically, you wrote this book to encourage people to go to college, or
Well, to encourage young people to focus on their education, as my parents indicated to me, that's your way up the socioeconomic ladder. And I was
Yes.
trying to get that notion across to them also. I mentioned earlier that I was interested in advertising and writing. I've
mm-hmm.
always had a mind for poetry, so it's a combination of advice to young people and some of the poetry that they might be interested in hearing.
So you're basically saying if you get hooked on, don't just sell yourself out that I have to make it through hip hop or through music. That education is a platform that can actually help
Exactly.
raise young.
There's nothing wrong with hip hop, but you
Nothing
need
wrong.
to have that education backup.
Right.
Because you never know. You have youngsters, young men in particular, who want to become superstar athletes, go off to professional football or basketball or baseball. The percentages aren't good in terms of your likelihood of going from high school to professional sports.
I heard it's like 1 in 1,000,000 or
Yeah, it's
something.
like 1%. Yeah.
Exactly. But if you got yourself a good education, if you can read, write, count, and think, you're on your way to a
To a
successful life.
successful career. And then you wrote here, whatever it takes. So you wrote something on a CD, like you were part of a CD that said whatever it takes.
Well, that's a combination of things. You got the
Okay.
book, and you got the CD.
Mm-hmm.
The CD is pull up your pants.
Oh.
You got young men walking around with the drawers showing. That's not a good look. When I was at the school, I talked to the young people all the time about what they need to look like when they're applying for a job. We didn't allow the girls to wear chip fingernails, chip paint on their fingernails. Skirts need to be at a certain length.
Wow.
The boys had to have a proper haircut. Take your earring out. You don't wear those. You want to. You only have one time to make a good first impression. Only one time to do that. So make sure you take advantage of that situation. So the book deals with all of those kinds
Wow.
of things. Pull up your pants. Don't dress like a hoochie mama. So I was using hip hop or to
Oh.
try to counter some of the hip hop messages that were out there at the time.
So this is actually a CD
That's
with
actually a
music
CD.
from you.
Uh-huh.
Wow. Okay.
And there's a story behind that too. Again, I told you earlier that I can't carry a tune in a bucket. But a friend of mine, Darko Velishkovsky, who was the president of the Jackson Symphony Orchestra, had done some work with some rappers at the time, and I told him that I was interested in putting some of my encouraging messages to young people to music. So he wrote the music for me
Wow.
and showed me how to do it. So we recorded it and came up with the album, and then the book is sort of a complement to the album.
Amazing. That's amazing. And we don't hear a lot of African Americans talking about pull up your pants, don't dress like a hoochie mama, rap for Jesus. Because when I got to the U.S., I was shocked at how the young men were dressing with their, pants falling, and they said it was cool, So I'm happy there are people who still say what we think is right, because I think everybody knows it, but they don't say it all the time.
Well, I'm old school when it comes to that. That's the way that I was brought up.
Right.
You want to make a good presentation of yourself at all times. We sort of lost that in too many respects. You got young people raising, youngsters raising youngsters these days, and they sort of lose that old school focus. Raise up the child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it.
Can you read that poem you wanted to read?
Let
It's
me
in
see
this
the,
book.
let,
Okay.
let me see
If
the
it's
book
in
a
there,
minute.
yeah.
There's a couple of them in there.
And you weren't there when Tougaloo 9 happened, right? You
Oh,
weren't?
no.
Okay, no.
No, that's way ahead of my time.
Okay.
But
Because a lot of my viewers don't know about it, but I just thought you might know
yeah,
a little bit.
Tougaloo certainly was a focal point of the civil rights era in Mississippi. A number of civil rights icons actually came through, and I guess it was the theme of a number of those. It's an AME, African American Episcopal, but
Oh,
the
really?
Episcopal Church, yeah, was very instrumental in helping to
Started.
support, yeah, and
Okay.
start. So,
Because I thought it
yeah.
was started by the Christ disciples. I thought that.
Yes,
But again, I'm not sure who started it.
yeah.
Okay.
Found one that I'll share.
Okay.
It's called Something My Mother Told Me. I'll always remember my mother, dear, and what she used to say. She said, the time will come when you'll call my name, and I will have gone away. Wrote this for my late mother. Until that day should come to pass, it's important that you should know a man, my son, will always reap whatever he would sow. She teach me verses to bless my food from that old Bible she always kept. If you forget the long one, she said, just remember, Jesus wept. The Bible, she would tell me, should be your guide through life. When all else fails, get on your knees and call on Jesus Christ. She was always there to comfort me whenever I would need it. She always gave me good advice and told me to always heed it. Work real hard, she'd admonish me, and never give up the fight. And don't even think about starting a task if you're not willing to do it right. Oh, there were times I did not listen to the wisdom of her words. The advice she tried to give to me would sometimes go unheard. It hit me in my 15th year. I felt like I was grown. I told my mother that I was a man. I could make it on my own. She pointed her finger and she said to me, about this you should have no doubt. I brought your behind into this world. Don't think I won't take you out. My mother said no greater love could anyone have for you, but I'll whip your tail from coast to coast if you don't do what I tell you to. She said the good book tells you, do not spare the rod. If that's what it takes to keep you straight, I'll do it. That comes from God. My mother read the good book and was quick to let you know it was her job to raise up the child in the way that he should go. So much for my teenage rebellion, my mama did not play. I'll always remember my mother, dear, and what she used to say. I'll never forget you, my dear.
Wow, that's awesome. So I just want to ask a question. As an educationist, what's your take on the spanking? And I know they've taken all that out of schools, and obviously you hear your mom says, you know.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm old school. I don't have a problem with it. When I was at the boarding school, we paddled, and there were people who have had problems with that. And as long as you're not abusing
the child, right?
Then I don't have a problem with it. I remember my late nephew. We were talking on an earlier segment about a Damascus kind of experience. He passed away at the age of 16, and I remember he and a couple of friends decided they wanted to smoke a joint, and I had to intervene and let him know that that was not the right thing to be doing. I got my paddle. I went down to the dorm. I told him how much I loved him. Then I paddled his behind, and that was it.
And this was in Piney Woods.
This was at Piney Woods. And I got another story like that. Congressman Benny Thompson.
Oh.
Congressman Thompson's daughter, Bendolin, went to Piney Woods.
Oh.
She was acting up one time, and the folks didn't know what to do with her. They called up Congressman Thompson. He came down. He took his belt off. He whipped her behind.
Oh, really?
And she now has a PhD in something.
She's
And she has a daughter who has a medical degree.
Oh, wow.
So I don't have a problem with putting putting the rod on the
On
behind.
the
So,
it straightens out the mind, right?
Oh,
Totally agree. Now, you guys were raised in the 60s, right?
I was raised in the 60s. I'm a
Okay.
little bit older than she
Okay.
is.
mhm.
So, how has America changed in your view since the 60s civil rights movement?
Well,
I know
I,
you were raised in Michigan where there was not as much segregation.
that's not quite true.
Mhm.
I mean, I was born in the Jim Crow South, and
In Georgia,
you could
right?
get in serious trouble by looking a white person in the eye the wrong kind of way. But I was raised most of my younger days in Michigan. I lived on one side of town. Saginaw Street divided the city north and south, and you knew that your place as a black person was on this side of the Saginaw, and you didn't go to the other
In
side of the street
Flint, Michigan,
in Flint, Michigan,
that
because
was not under segregation.
well, they didn't not outright like it was
It
in
wasn't part
the
of the Confederacy, right? That's what I meant,
like
right?
it was
Correct.
in the South, but it was there.
Really?
Racist.
I remember, for instance, um, when we talk about discrimination kinds of issues. I told you earlier I was in the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts, be prepared, be a gentleman at all times. I remember there was a store called Hamady Brothers, and this older white woman was coming out the door. I held the door for her. She looked at me and went out the other door. Those those
Little
kinds of
things.
messages,
Right.
and it's
So
still there.
America has come a long way.
It's come a long way, but it still
It's
has a
gone
long
back.
long
Yeah.
way to go.
Wow.
A long way to go. Going back to Flint, in terms of the '60s, there were the black cops and the white cops. The black cops weren't allowed to arrest white people, basically. And if you lived in the black community, didn't. You were often afraid of the interaction that you might have with the police because they're sworn to protect, but they didn't always protect the black folks. So
But you know, one thing I've noticed, poverty doesn't discriminate, food insecurity doesn't discriminate.
Correct.
So when you ship your food out to the 150,000, you don't care whether they're Latino, black, white, Mexican, whatever.
Christian, Muslim,
You just,
whatever.
your job is to help people who need food.
Amen.
And I think that's what we're saying here, that's what Christ will do. Not the color of your skin, not the background, but just meet the need when you see it. And that's what you have come to Mississippi this last 9 years, and you've shaped that and done that. And for that, we're grateful. So just want to let you know, we'll be back. The final show, we'll talk about the family and the friends and the environment that raised this wonderful couple called Charles and Helen Beatty. God bless you. See you then. Amen.